Hello, good morning. So we're going to read chapter 33, The End of Napoleon, for this week. This is this week's history chapter, and then you can do your map work and your worksheets that are in the single sheet protectors, okay? All right, Napoleon's Wars and 1812-2. While settlers were beginning to trickle west, a different kind of invasion was taking place in Europe. The Emperor Napoleon was pushing the border of his empire further and further out, until most of Europe was forced to salute the French flag. After Napoleon lost the Battle of Trafalgar to the British Navy, the British asked Austria and Russia to join with Britain in defying Napoleon. The two countries agreed. Just a month after Trafalgar, the Austrian and Russian armies gathered together to fight Napoleon's great army, but Napoleon avenged his defeat at Trafalgar. The Austrian armies His soldiers smashed through the combined lines of the Russians and Austrians. Austria was forced to give up all of its land in Italy. Napoleon gave the city of Naples to his brother Joseph to rule. The Prussian army marched against Napoleon and was defeated. The Russians retreated and then attacked again and lost. The Tsar of Russia, Alexander I, was Catherine the Great's grandson. But he didn't have Catherine's stubborn will. He was tired of fighting Napoleon. He signed a treaty promising to give Napoleon part of Poland in exchange for peace. Now, Napoleon had Europe under his thumb. But England still irritated him. Why couldn't he beat the British? Napoleon knew better than to try to invade Britain again. So, he decided to starve the British instead. He announced that no British ships could dock at any European port, no country in Europe would be permitted to buy English goods, any ship from any country that went to Britain with food or supplies would be seized and its captain accused of treachery against France. The little country of Portugal on the coast of Spain objected. Portugal made a lot of money trading with the English. If Britain starved, the Portuguese might starve too. Napoleon wasn't going to let tiny Portugal defy him, but in order to attack Portugal by land, he had to go through Spain. So he marched into Spain, removed the Spanish king, gave Spain to his brother Joseph too, and headed towards Portugal with his army. But Napoleon never managed to conquer Portugal. The Spanish, who hated Joseph, occupied his army with rebellions and revolts. And then Alexander I, the Tsar of Russia, changed his allegiance. He declared that he was no longer Napoleon's friend and ally. Napoleon's huge empire was acting like a bucket of fish, all caught, but still trying to wiggle out under the edge of the bucket. Napoleon decided that the Russian fish needed to be caught and shoved back in. So he massed his army all together, and in June of 1812, marched over 500,000 men into Russia. That's over 500,000 soldiers. It's crazy. Instead of standing up and fighting, the Russians retreated. Napoleon's army marched further into Russia. The Russians retreated some more. By late summer, the French army was spread across 700 miles. Napoleon kept marching, ordering his troops to burn and destroy the countryside as he went. In the second week of September, he arrived at Moscow. The beautiful city was mostly empty. Napoleon ordered his army to burn it to the ground. Then he sent word to Alexander I, offering to sign a treaty with him. No answer came. Alexander had planned all along to lure Napoleon into Russia. "We have vast spaces to retreat in," he had told his advisors. "We will leave it to winter to wage our war for us." Napoleon had been caught in the same trap as the Swedish army years before. While he waited in Moscow for word that Alexander would surrender, the air grew colder and colder. Far away, Alexander remarked, "Before I sign a peace treaty, I'll go eat potatoes in Siberia." That means he's never going to sign a peace treaty because potatoes will not grow in Siberia because it's so cold. And he let Napoleon wait some more. Finally, Napoleon ordered the French army home. but it was already October. The French were marching home through the country they had burned on the march in. There was no food anywhere in this shattered countryside. They were wearing summer uniforms. Snow started to flake gently down from the sky. The temperature fell to 30 degrees below zero. Soldiers began to freeze in their tracks. "The road is covered with our men frozen to death," one of Napoleon's generals wrote. "We have thrown away our guns. They are too cold to hold. We step over the dead as we walk." When the French army reached the Berezina River, the border between Russia and Poland, they discovered that the Russians had burned all the bridges. Finally, Napoleon's army struggled across the freezing water to the other side. 600,000 men had died. Only 40,000 soldiers remained. Oh my goodness. The conquered states of Europe took heart. The French-ruled countries of Prussia, Germany, Austria, and Italy began to chant, "Down with France!" Even in France itself, Napoleon's subjects were growing tired of war, blood, and destruction. In the streets of Paris, people grumbled about Napoleon. A few voices murmured, "Down with the emperor." The murmur grew louder. Napoleon, hearing of these mutterings, hurried the shattered remnants of his army back to Paris. Europe was about to slip from his grasp. The Americans chose that exact moment to pick a fight with the British. For several years, American sea captains had been complaining about the way they were treated by the English. British ships always needed more seamen to help fight the long war against Napoleon, so their captains had taken to stopping United States ships at sea, announcing that the American soldiers were English deserters and taking them on board to serve in the Royal Navy. Americans were also angry that British soldiers had come down from Canada to help Tecumseh and his Shawnee warriors attack American settlers. So on June 18th, 1812, the United States declared war on Britain. Britain didn't want to turn around and fight the United States. It had its hands full with Napoleon. But while Napoleon rushed back to Paris to defend his power, the British sent part of their navy over to America. The English ships sailed into Lake Erie and Lake Michigan and landed British soldiers on the shore, ready to invade Ohio. At that, Tecumseh saw one more chance to fight against the United States. He declared that the Shawnee were allies with the British in the War of 1812. He and his warriors helped the British soldiers invade the Northwest Territory and capture the city of Detroit. For a full year, Tecumseh's Shawnee warriors fought alongside the British. And then, William Henry Harrison, now a general commanding part of the American army, marched against Tecumseh once more. In a huge battle, Harrison defeated the combined British, Native American army, and drove them back out of the Northwest. And Tecumseh was killed. His body disappeared from the battlefield. His warriors took it away and buried it in a secret spot. The Americans had won in the Northwest, but the British were still fighting. The following summer, British ships landed on the shores of Washington, D.C. President James Madison fled just ahead of soldiers who stormed into Washington and set fire to the Capitol building. The Library of Congress and all of its books went up in bright, hot flame. The soldiers looted the president's house, stole its treasures, piled up its red velvet chairs, and lit them. Soon, the whole house was wreathed in fire and smoke. But the British didn't really want to occupy America. They had too much work to do fighting Napoleon. So finally, the two countries signed a treaty. They agreed to behave as if the war had never happened. The War of 1812 had achieved absolutely nothing. By 1814, France was demanding that Napoleon make peace. Austria, Russia, Prussia, and Great Britain swore together to stay united until Napoleon was defeated. Once more, Napoleon rallied his army. he marched out of France toward the combined armies of Europe. While he was gone, a French official announced that the emperor no longer ruled. Messengers had been sent to Louis XVIII, the brother of the guillotined king. Louis, who had been living in England, was a fat, slow-witted man, almost 60 years old, and he agreed to come back to France as its king. Facing a huge army, without the support of his own country, Napoleon finally admitted defeat. The British, Russian, Austrian, and Prussian allies met together and decided that Napoleon should be taken to the tiny, rocky island of Elba in the Mediterranean Sea. Here, Napoleon was told, he could still have the title Emperor, the Emperor of Elba. He could still have his army, with 400 men in it. Napoleon would spend the rest of his life on an island 7 miles wide, watching the sardine boats float by and the olives grow. Whew. Okay, next little section says, Waterloo! Exclamation point. Waterloo. Famous, famous. Napoleon Bonaparte, the monster of Europe, now spent his days in exile. He was made the ruler of Elba, which had a few people on it, and given a staff so he could form a little island government. He had a small palace, his mother and sister came to live with him, and the French government had agreed to send him money every year so he could run his little island. Napoleon bustled around his island, working in his garden and adding rooms onto his palace. He improved the roads, built bridges, and tried to make the fields bear better crops. But the man who had once ruled Europe was bored. He was angry. He was humiliated. Tourists sailed to Elba just to see the famous Napoleon in his prison. And as time went on, he got poorer. France never sent a single penny of the money it had promised. Back in France, Louis XVIII was not making himself popular. He was determined that people would treat him with the same respect that the Bourbon kings of France had always been given, just as if the revolution had never happened. In his first big public appearance, he fell down and was not able to get up without help. He wouldn't allow anyone to help him up, but the most important of all the palace officials, he wouldn't allow anyone to help him up but the most important of all the palace officials. So he had to lie on the ground until the official could be found. A lot of pride this guy has. The common people of France began to fear that the king would once again become a tyrant, doing anything he wanted. Napoleon watched his country from a distance. He wrote letters to the soldiers who remained in France. Many of them wrote back, telling them that he should return to France and chase the Bourbon king away. Napoleon knew that the leaders of Europe were discussing sending him much further away, to some distant island in the Atlantic Ocean. Once that happened, he would never escape. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon arranged for a ship with soldiers, gold, guns, and ammunition to dock at Elba. He told his mother he was leaving to go fight again. "Good," she said. "Go die with your sword in your hand, not sitting here in exile." Okay. Napoleon boarded the ship and was away before anyone in Europe realized what was happening. He landed at Cannes, France, with his little guard. "I am the Emperor of Elba," he announced. "I've come with my 600 men to attack the King of France and his army of 600,000, but I'll conquer." He started towards Paris. The peasants, remembering the bad old days of the monarchy, flocked to welcome him. The nearest division of the French army was sent to arrest him, but when Napoleon saw them approaching, he told his own men to play the French national song, the Marseillaise. Then he walked forward, holding open his coat. "I'm your emperor," he shouted. "Do you recognize me? If any one of you would like to kill your own emperor, here I am. 45 of your own leaders have invited me back. 3 European countries stand behind my return." The soldiers lowered their weapons. Someone cheered, and soon the soldiers were shouting, "Long live the emperor!" Upon hearing the terrible news, Louis XVIII sent his top general to stop Napoleon. But when this general met Napoleon, He found himself unable to arrest his former emperor. He had fought by Napoleon's side too many times. Instead, he joined in the parade. Louis ran from Paris. Just 3 weeks after landing, Napoleon arrived in the city and took back his throne. Not a single shot had been fired. "I am here in the spirit of the revolution," Napoleon announced. "I have come to free the people of France from the slavery of the priests and nobles." Does it sound familiar? Yes. Napoleon had used the same line twice before, once in Italy and once in Egypt. But he didn't bring freedom either time, and he didn't bring freedom this time either. The excitement soon began to fade, and soon everyone could see that the common people of France were no better off than they had been under Louis XVIII. As soon as England, Austria, and Prussia heard about Napoleon's return, they moved their armies towards the French border. They were not going to let the monster of Europe eat their countries one more time. Napoleon managed to raise an army of 72,000 soldiers. He marched to meet the English army at Waterloo, a village just south of the Belgian town of Brussels. The English army, commanded by the Duke of Wellington, had almost as many men as Napoleon's army. The battle raged evenly for hours. Thousands of men died on both sides. The English fought bravely, but so did the French surrounding Napoleon. Finally, Prussian soldiers arrived to reinforce the English. Napoleon was defeated and his soldiers scattered. The general who had joined him instead of arresting him was captured and shot. Napoleon's 100 days of power were over. Even from exile, with an unprepared army, Napoleon had come close to defeating Wellington's men. As he walked through the battlefield, the Duke of Wellington kept repeating, "A close thing, a very close thing." Many of his own friends lay dead. Napoleon went back to Paris and wrote out a paper, giving up the throne of France again. Then he quietly left the city. For a few weeks, no one was quite sure where Napoleon was. He was actually hiding in the homes of old friends, deciding what to do next. He thought he would like to go to the United States and study botany, but the British shut down the ports of France to keep any ships from leaving until Napoleon was found. Finally, Napoleon gave up and surrendered to the British. Now, the British had to decide what to do with him. They didn't want him in the United States, stirring up trouble, or back on Elba where he might escape again. If they executed him, the French, who had welcomed him back, might revolt. The British would have been very happy for France to offer to execute him. But the French didn't suggest such a plan. Finally, the British announced that they were going to send Napoleon to St. Helena, far off in the Atlantic, 1,200 miles west of Africa. The little island was only 10 miles long and 6 miles wide. It was even smaller and barer than Elba. On October 15, 1815, Napoleon arrived at his exile. Even on this tiny little island, he wasn't allowed to go anywhere without an English officer following him. So he spent most of his time in the study of his house. He wrote a book about his life, read books in French and English, played cards, and sometimes gave small parties. Even though he was far from Europe, tourists still came to look at him. One English writer, William Makepeace Thackeray, remembered seeing Napoleon. When Thackeray was 5, his ship stopped at St. Helena, and a servant took him to see a man walking in the garden. "There's Bonaparte," the servant whispered. "He eats 3 sheep every day, and as many small children as he can get a hold of." 2 years after arriving at St. Helena, Napoleon began to complain about stomach aches. It became worse and worse. Doctors could do nothing to make him better. By 1821, Napoleon could no longer get out of his bed. He asked for paper to write his last will. At the end of it, he wrote, "I wish my ashes to rest on the banks of the Seine, in the middle of that French people which I have loved so much." He also wrote, "I'm not dying a natural death. I've been killed by the English and their hired assassins." Napoleon thought he'd been poisoned, but he was probably dying of stomach cancer. A few hours later, Napoleon died. He was buried on the island, but his stone had no name. It merely read, "Here lies," as though the name of Napoleon were too frightening to be spoken out loud. The end. That is our history chapter for this week. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you like your map work and your discussion questions. Okay? See you later.